مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الهجمات الإلكترونية، كما كان كلاوزويتز ربما ليقول، حرب بوسائل أخرى. فكروا في التالي: استخدمت إيران تكنولوجيا الإنترنت لمهاجمة بنوك أمريكية والسد في ولاية نيويورك. استخدمت أمريكا وإسرائيل تكنولوجيا الإنترنت لمهاجمة برنامج إيران النووي. روسيا والصين والدول حول العالم تستخدم الإنترنت كل يوم لسرقة الأسرار والأسلحة والمال والهويات من الأصدقاء والإعداء على حد سواء. وهنا في أمريكا حسمت معركة كبرى بين الحكومة الفيدرالية وواحدة من أكبر شركاتنا وهي أبل كمبيوترز، ليس على يد محكمة أو كادن أو هيئتنا التشريعية، وإنما لأن متسللا شخص يقتحم أنظمة الكمبيوتر حل المشكلة. إن كانت تكنولوجيا الإنترنت مسرحا للحرب، فهل نحن على أهبة الاستعداد؟ هل نحن آمنون في الخارج ومستعدون على الجبهة الداخلية؟ ماذا يلزمنا أن نفعل أكثر من ذلك لنقاتل وننتصر؟ لمناقشة هذه القضايا الراهنة يسرني أن أرحب بواحدة من أكثر الصحفيات دراية بقضايا التكنولوجيا والإنترنت، وهي سارة سورتشر. And welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with Sarah Sorcher to talk about technology, politics, and national security. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, the US government versus Apple, what could have been one of the great legal challenges of the century. So let's take a step back. What was this issue all about between this huge technology company and the federal government?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of people who would say that this issue is far, far from resolved, even though the US government did drop the actual court case against Apple. But it all comes down to this big case where you had an Islamic State-inspired terror attack taking place in San Bernardino, California. And the FBI had access to the actual device itself, but they were not able to get the contents on the phone off of the device for this investigation, which was the biggest terrorist attack on US soil since 9/11. So you saw them ask Apple for their help, and Apple says that they complied and were able to turn over some of the information that they had, but not the contents of the communications, which were very strongly encrypted to the point where the company didn't even have the key to give the FBI. So this is really what gets to the heart of the encryption debate that's been going on for the last couple of years or so, where law enforcement feels like it's going dark in its pursuit of criminals and terrorists in the US and is locked out of all sorts of devices, but companies are saying that these types of security protections are critical to protect their consumers from hackers and governments seeking to get access to it.
So why did this become such an explosive issue that it engulfed politicians and the ordinary Americans seem to care about this so much?
Yeah, well, I think you see everybody has a phone or some sort of device these days. I mean, you are talking about Apple, which is the world's largest tech company. I have an iPhone, you might have an iPhone. So you're really talking about security and privacy that goes to, that is accessible to everybody now, and what is going to be the layer of protection that's available to everyday people. And from the government's perspective, as this technology and strong security becomes more and more prevalent, that's more and more devices that they can't get access to. And so it really goes to the question of what is the role of government, and can they force companies to write code and have security measures that they want to see, or will security and privacy protections trump that?
And what was the political lineup on either
Very
side,
complicated
both in the
one.
corporate world and in the broader political world for this contest?
Yeah, you saw Apple have a lot of support in the tech industry. You saw dozens of companies and advocacy groups on all sides of the political spectrum line up behind Apple. Apple was essentially saying, okay, it's not really just about this one phone in San Bernardino, it's about everybody's phones, because if we have this tool that's available to law enforcement to get into the device, then we could be asked to use this in all sorts of other cases and all sorts of other devices. And so that has implications not just for Apple devices, but for all of American technology companies. And so you really saw a big mobilization on the tech side and the privacy side, on the side of Apple, and then you have people like FBI Director Comey on the other side, because his whole goal is to get access for his investigations. And you have intelligence officials coming out in support of him, and police departments across the country saying that they also have devices that they're locked out of, and people who are more traditionally national security hawks, you see them going kind of both ways. And so you see people who want to have the FBI and intelligence agencies have the access that they need to keep the country safe. But then you also have people like Michael Hayden, for instance, who says that unbreakable encryption makes the country safer. That's a former NSA and CIA director coming out and saying that. You have people like Lindsey Graham, who is traditionally hawkish on many national security issues, saying that the more he learns about it, the more he realizes that the country's cybersecurity and the issues they face from hackers are more important. You have people really coming together, Republicans and Democrats on each side, and you are sort of seeing that debate play out, because it really comes down less between Republicans and Democrats, left or right, but more about what you see the role of government is and what should be Americans' privacy and personal security rights.
So take this another step, because I'm not quite sure that either I or our viewers will appreciate the view ascribed to those who say maximal encryption is really good for us, that having this hermetically sealed encryption is better for our team than the terrorists who might be able to use it.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that people would respond to that. I think that you have to think about it in the sense that hackers, criminals from other countries, they're always looking for ways to get into devices, to steal people's financial information, healthcare information, to compromise people's identities, to basically take whatever they want. And the only thing that stands in between that is the security that's on the device or the application, or that either the consumer chooses to deploy or that is deployed by default by the companies. And that's really what we're talking about here. So it really comes down to, what do you think is more important? People's personal security and the risks that come with having weak security, or national security for these kind of big picture investigations. It's also more complicated because really what we're talking about here in the US is only American companies, and encryption is something that's available everywhere. So you can have open source encryption, you can make your own encryption, you can get encryption from that's made in other countries that's out of the reach of the US government. So there are people who make the argument that even if you start to regulate this kind of encryption and security in the United States, that people who are actually seeking to use this kind of technology to hide their communications will be able to get it from all sorts of other places. They say essentially, this is already out in the world and you can't really put it back in the box, and that law enforcement just has to get better at the tools that they use to be able to access this.
So speaking of the tools that they use, it appears that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, our nation's domestic law enforcement institution, hired or contracted hackers, people who we tend to think of as sleazy characters, shady characters who are out there trying to burrow inside technology companies and banks and whatever, hired hackers to solve this Apple iPhone problem. Is that what happened?
Well, we don't know exactly who offered up this tool to the FBI to help them break into the San Bernardino iPhone. But there are hackers who are employed by companies or self-employed who go and who try to hack into companies or who are paid to hack into products, and they find these software vulnerabilities or whatever flaws they find, and they turn them over to the companies to be fixed.
So these are good guy hackers.
Good guy hackers, white hat hackers. And then you have other hackers, maybe more along the lines of the ones you mentioned, who are black hat hackers who find these types of holes into products, and they use them to steal people's information or for whatever else they are trying to gain from it, or for espionage. Countries, might be trying to get whatever flaws they can find in, American systems or other country systems for whatever political reasons they want, and they hold on to them, and they might use them for those reasons. There are all sorts of reasons why people are trying to hold on to flaws they find. From the reports that are out there, it seems like the FBI had a contract with what's known as gray hat hackers, which is somewhere in the middle. So people who are trying to find these flaws, but then they sell them to governments for some sort of fee. And we don't know who they are. We don't know exactly what it is, other than it was a previously unknown vulnerability into a product that they were able to turn over to the FBI, and in this case use successfully. But beyond that, we don't really know much more than that.
But as far as we do know, the actual legal case is now off the table.
The Justice Department always said that that case was always about this one phone, even though there were a lot of people who said that any kind of legal precedent that came out of that would have been used inevitably in any other cases that applied, and could be used as a legal precedent for more devices. But as soon as they found a way into the phone, sure enough, the Justice Department did drop the case, and so that legal channel is over, but they are still suing another Apple in another case in New York, and so this is definitely something you're going to still see, even though this is done in the San Bernardino case in terms of the legal avenue. And now you have a whole other set of issues in that the FBI has a way to get into a whole, class of devices and has not told the company about it.
Oh, fascinating. So when we come back, we're going to talk more about cybersecurity, the balance between security and privacy, and put this in the context of a man named Edward Snowden in just a moment. Our guest today is Sarah Sorcher. Sarah is the deputy editor of Passcode, a section of the venerable Christian Science Monitor that covers security, privacy, and technology. Previously, Sarah was national security correspondent for the National Journal, reporting from the Pentagon, the State Department, and Capitol Hill. In 2014, she won a special award from the National Press Club for her articles on how political gridlock and shrinking budgets impacted the defense and aerospace industry. Earlier, Sarah worked as a freelance journalist in the Middle East, with articles that were featured in such major outlets as ABC News, the New York Times, Time, and CNN. So let's look at the broader swing of time between the national debate over security and privacy. This has gone back and forth since 9/11. And then we had an injection of urgency from a man named Edward Snowden. So what did he do to the debate, and how has that debate shifted in the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's been going on for a long time, and actually this particular debate over encryption stretches back all the way into the 1990s in the United States. But really, the newest encryption debate started in earnest after the Edward Snowden leaks in 2013. You saw some pretty open hostility from Silicon Valley after those leaks.
Remind our viewers who Edward Snowden was.
Edward Snowden is a former National Security Agency contractor who revealed widespread U.S. government surveillance, collecting tons of communications records, including from Americans, and a lot of explosive leaks that caused a national debate in the United States over the right to privacy. And so after that, American companies pretty quickly started to realize the business implications for just how people would start to look at their products. They started to spend billions of dollars in some cases to build data centers overseas just to combat this impression that the US government had access to customers' data. And there were a lot of forecasts showing how much money they would use and they would lose. And you also started to see security teams across the country look at the threats facing their consumers differently. They started to focus more on this semi-omniscient adversary, now the global passive adversary, now kind of codename for the NSA, which could see everything, basically. If you're hacking into the internet backbone, if you're lurking at the data center, if you have big data analytics tools, you have a much wider view of what's going on online than a hacker sitting in a coffee shop trying to get through the internet to get to somebody's computer. So all of this combined led companies to try to figure out a way forward. And one of those ways was by having stronger and stronger encryption on their devices by default. So nobody had to even think about it. The consumer didn't have to think about it, but it would just be on there. And so they could say, hey, you know, this is hard for hackers, it protects your security, but also if anybody, any government wants to get access to it, that's tough, no dice. And so that's really what's at the core of this issue here, is that that, of course, presents a big problem for law enforcement and intelligence officials, because if they can't get access to that data either, if the company doesn't even have a key to turn over, can't even turn over communications when they have a warrant, then that's really what's at the heart of this debate.
So let me put this in personal terms. Over the last year, I think I've received at least 3 notices that my identity, my information has been compromised. You too. From a government agency and 2 corporations. Now that's not the federal government that misused my information. Those are people trying to steal this stuff. So who's doing that, and what, you know, how well prepared are we to prevent this and combat it?
Yeah, there's a huge market out there for people's identities online. I mean, you go onto the dark web and there's a number value assigned that's to your healthcare records, because if you think about your healthcare records, has your date of birth, all of your personal information, your address, your social security number, all of your identifying information that we use here in the US to basically, you know, prove that you're you. And that's for sale. There are people who are trying to take advantage of tax returns from the government. There are other countries that are looking to gather intelligence for their purposes too. So there's a lot of things that are going on the internet, and it comes down to the security that people have to protect against it. And the government itself is not exempt. I mean, you have the Office of Personnel Management leak, which compromised some 22 million people's personal information. And that's very, very personal stuff that people gave for background checks to the government. So you're seeing all sorts of things. You know, that was quite probably another country trying to take that information, but you know, it's raised a lot of questions about whether the U.S. government itself was even putting enough security on that kind of personal data.
So if other countries and criminals around the world are trying to do that against Americans and against the American government, how does the encryption debate play into that? Does it empower? Will encryption empower governments and corporations to be to have better defenses against this, or does it weaken our law enforcement ability to protect against bad guys doing bad things? Or both?
I think it depends on how it goes. I think that a lot of people are looking at what's happening now in the U.S. around the world as a possible precedent, because if you allow the U.S. government to have access and you maybe make, some would say, the technology a little bit weaker because the security technology a little bit weaker because somebody else besides the user has access to it, then other countries might also want to demand that same access around the world. You could have China, which is already pushing forward with a bill that would allow, that would turn over encryption keys to the government for their own investigations. You're seeing some issues percolating in Brazil over WhatsApp, which has end-to-end encryption now as well. So there are a lot of things playing out all over the world where people are testing the boundaries of national security versus privacy within their borders. And a lot of countries are looking for this kind of access within their borders. So, you know, it doesn't just affect American companies and the American government, because if there is some sort of precedent set for the US government, then they might have to give that same access to other countries around the world, and other countries around the world might use it for all sorts of different reasons that are not subject to the American legal framework. And I think when it comes to setting a precedent in terms of how protected people are, government officials here are very careful in saying we should not accuse people of doing things that we wouldn't do. So in the case of OPM, for instance,
the Office of Personnel Management.
The Office of Personnel Management, where that compromised the 22 million people's personal records of former and current government employees, that's espionage. That is sort of a generally accepted form of, if you can get into a system and you can take that kind of personal information for your own country's benefit, then that is not, it's a hack, but it's a different kind of hack. And it's not to say that the US government isn't also trying to do those things as well. So they have been very clear about, we shouldn't, when we're in a very fragile glass house, then you shouldn't be, throwing stones at someone else.
And in terms of other Western democracies, I know you cited China, and in terms of our partners in Western democracies, are they having similar debates? Do we learn lessons from what they're doing? Do you know?
Yeah, for sure. In Europe, this is a huge thing as well. David Cameron has floated banning messaging apps like WhatsApp and other companies' products until the government has access, and there are a lot of pieces of legislation that are moving there too. So it's not just something that's taking place in China, and it's not just in the U.S. for sure. It's everywhere, and everybody is trying to figure out what the appropriate balance is going to be, because this is technology that's available to everybody now.
Okay, Sarah Sorcher, thank you very much for delving into this highly important issue of security, privacy, and encryption. Thank you for joining us on Dakhel Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول كيف قد تؤثر الهجمات الإلكترونية على بلدكم، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.